My name is Neil Raymond Price. I have been a professional game designer for about 15 years now. I have worked in literally all of the systems that you just mentioned, except Sentinels. That I didn't do, but I did playtest that. So that was cool. Most notably, I've done most of my work with White Wolf and with Onyx Path, designing in the World of Darkness and designing those things. I designed Onyx Path's home system called the Storypath System, which is a descendant of Storyteller that's used in World of Darkness stuff. And I've done most of my design in trad gaming, so that's what we're going to focus on in here. But I am going to mention more indie gaming and more story gaming like PBTA a little bit. So this is a workshop, so I will occasionally be asking for a call for hands, and I will be asking for people to call out. So don't be afraid to do that. Don't be afraid to be the first one or the tall poppy. And if you have a question on something, I'm happy to answer it as well. So let's begin. So who in here has designed their own system before or has designed any iteration of it? Are you just here to learn to do that? Okay, you guys have? You just want to design a system? Okay, cool. So I did a lot of my early design work with a designer named Jenna Moran. She wrote Glitch, she wrote Chubo's Marvelous Wish Granting Machine, she did Nobilis, and she did a lot of work on Exalted for White Wolf. And Jenna was really the first one who taught me that story follows mechanics, and story and mechanics dictate what choices players can make in the game. If you think about game theory, and you think about a lot of the classic problems, when you give someone a limited number of options, it becomes about which option they're going to take. So the first thing you need to do when you think about designing a system is not design a system that can do absolutely everything. One of the reasons I picked up on Powered by the Apocalypse earlier, and that was mentioned there, is because Powered by the Apocalypse does a very interesting thing because it takes a step back from traditional gaming, and it asks why those story structures are there, and it gives designers tools to build a genre-specific experience. Sometimes, I don't know if anyone here has played Mass, A New Generation, which is a Powered by the Apocalypse game. Mass is, I see sometimes some people recommending it for generic superhero games. And you could do Mutants and Masterminds, you could do Champions, you could do Sentinels, you could do that. And someone's like, oh, you can do Mass. And Mass is not good as a generic superhero game. And actually, none of those things are great as a generic superhero game. Well, they're great as a generic one, but they're not good for the purpose-built stuff. What you need in Cosmic Marvel is different than what you need in DC. It's different than what you need from a street-level Chronicle. It's different from X-Men. There are different structures and different genres you want to emulate and different pieces that you want in the game. So Mass is very, very good at providing one specific type of superhero story, and that's teen superheroes. And it uses learning to be as part of a team and learning to use your superpowers as a metaphor for growing up. And that's sort of the game's high concept. And what you want to think about in a game is what your high concepts are going to be and what your kind of popcorn play at the table is going to be. And you want to start there. Before you even think about dice, before you think about anything else, you need to think, what is the experience I am trying to get the players to engage with? What is the experience I want to convey to the players? What sort of generation of stories do I want them to tell with this? And you need to tell your mechanics around that. Whether you're designing in an already extant system or you're building something from scratch, that's where you need to start. Doing a truly universal system has been tried by a lot of folks, and like they say, the master, jack of all trades, master of none, right? So, and that's okay, but it's not always what people want to design for. So, after you've thought about what kind of experience, what kind of high concept you want, you have to also think about like the play experience at the table, what players are going through, and what their what sort of mechanisms you want to empower them with. I had a bit of an easy task designing Storypath because I got to start with storyteller and storytelling, which is a very traditional design, but was sort of meant to be the first type of story game. It doesn't really have story mechanics. Does everyone know what I'm talking about when I say trad versus story? Okay, cool. So traditional RPGs go by are games, and that's actually very important to think about because a lot of times, especially early in my career, I'd have someone come up to me and be like, "Hey, I really want to write, but I'm a prose writer. I don't do mechanics." And I'm like, "Well, you really don't want to write for an RPG. You want to write a novel because it's right there in the name. It is a role-playing game, and you have to think about the experience that players are having and then how they're engaging with it as a game on a game level." So, story games, trad gaming is much more simulationist. It's about simulating things in the world and simulating things that happen. And they tend towards complexity. And you'll see that especially in a lot of older designs. If you've ever looked at like an early edition of Shadowrun or an earlier edition of Battletech or something like that, it's just like hit charts, like charts after charts after charts, and stuff you roll and things you can do. And there's a place for that, especially in OSR, which loves that sort of thing. But it can get very messy very quickly. One of the other big prime rules that you should keep in mind in this is that simplicity is key. As simple as you can make a system, it's going to be better. If you're trying to design that aforementioned generic system in order to make more bespoke systems to the type of experience you're trying to create, again, the Storypath system, I over-designed that as a sort of the next step from storyteller. I over-designed it and I put in a lot of bells and whistles and what another developer of mine called levers, which are just essentially mechanics that you can hang other mechanics on, or mechanics that can lead to other experiences later down the line. And I did that because I knew that this was going to be used for a bunch of iterative games. And so the Storypath system does Scion, which is a story about the children of gods who eventually grow into gods themselves. So it goes all the way from man in the street to God in the sky. It does Trinity, which is about psychic superheroes in the far future. It does Aberrant, which is about superheroes in the modern day. It does Dystopia Rising, which is about psychic zombies, a lot of psychics. All of those have a different experience. All of those have different play styles and genres, and even power levels associated with them. But they were each able to kind of hang their other system mechanics on stuff that we'd already built into there. So when you're designing something, you have to think about the levers, and you have to think about, what do I want this system to do? And that I'm going to keep coming back to that because it really is the most important question you need to keep asking yourself. And every time you run a play test and you look at the results, you say, is it doing what I want it to do? What's coming out of this? Yes?
I think I understand what you mean by levers, but could you give like a more concrete example?
Certainly. So Storypath got its name because there's a mechanic called paths in there. And paths can be rated 1 to 5, and then they can have a series of things under them. They are given attributes like allies or contacts or resources or influence over a certain thing. But it's meant to be influence over a specific element of the game world that relates to the high concept of the path. So, for example, a path can just be a simple phrase that describes your character and describes what their place in the world is, and that is similar to an aspect in Fate. So you might be the son of the police chief, let's say. So you'd have a bit of influence over the police department. You'd have access to the police department. You might have some contacts that someone normally wouldn't have just by virtue of being that person. And if you actually are a cop, then you just get all access to like the police station or the evidence locker pretty much automatically. So I over-design paths, like they're rated 1 to 5, and they have all these features, and they have all these things, and they don't need to. And in a lot of the games, they don't have those things because they're just extraneous. But I put them in there, and I made them work nicely together because I knew that people would want to pick different pieces of it that they really liked and use, and still have it relate back to the core mechanic. So that's what I mean by levers. Is that clear? That's a better example?
You have stuff you can build off of the page.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, trad games simulate the world, but more story games, which are a much more recent phenomenon, and every time people talk about indie games, they're generally talking about some flavor of story game. Story games are much more about the story that's actually being told. And, it's right there in the name. They are much more bespoke mechanics designed to evoke a specific experience and designed to cause certain things. Again, Powered by the Apocalypse has what are called moves, which are specific things that you can do in the game world. And pretty much everything that you do, everything that a character can do, gets boiled down to those moves, whether they're defending or they're attacking or they're doing something like that. And the moves change according to your playbooks, which are kind of like classes, but more like descriptive elements of your character. And according to the game, the zombie world moves are way different than the ones in Samurai World, or I think it's called Thousand Arrows now. But so that's what we mean by story games, and there is a happy medium between the two, if you want. But as you look more into indie design game culture, there's a lot of really interesting games on itch.io. So it's itch.io. And they're, generally fairly cheap games, but they're sometimes no more than a couple pages. And that's something else I want to really stress to all of you. If you are designing a role-playing game and you're starting off, you don't need to design a 256 full-color page core book. You don't need to if you don't want to. A game can be nothing more than a page. Sometimes not even that. If you want to get into the really fancy and twee stuff, like I've seen designers design a game on a business card. And they're like, look at me, I'm a game designer. And it's like, cool. All right. Your game doesn't need to do everything, and it doesn't need to do long-term play. Like players don't need to sit down and play it every week for a year straight, right? Some systems are built to accommodate that kind of growth and that kind of complexity. Some systems aren't. I mentioned Fate and Powered by the Apocalypse a bunch earlier. Those games aren't great for long-term play. They're great for getting in, getting the experience that you want, maybe, going a little bit further, going to another character arc, and then getting out and starting a new one. And that's okay. That's what the designers were looking for. That's the experience that they wanted. They didn't want to see the system kind of have to accommodate and buckle under the weight of some character that's being played for 10 years. And very few systems can actually accommodate that sort of thing. Like D&D certainly can't. I think in 5e, once you hit 20th level, you just stop. Yeah. And older games had epic levels, or you could take another level in a class, and it's like, good Lord. Like, play something else. But that's also something you need to think about at the design and the start of the design outset. What do I want the play experience to be? What do I want the length to be? What do I want the character progression arc to go? And you almost always want to have a character progression arc, unless it's something built for just one-shots. And that's okay too. Like, I want to stress that. Like, just because your game is meant for a one-shot, that's totally fine. 10 Candles is a great game. It's about surviving in the last days of the apocalypse. And 10 Candles, when the last candle goes out, everyone's dead. And things get progressively worse as the candles dwindle down from 10 to 0. And it's not so much about whether you'll die or whether you can survive. It's about how you die. and how you survive in the time that you have left. And by the end of it, everyone's dead. There's no character progression. You don't play ghosts, right? So that's okay. That's meant for a one-shot. It's perfect. You sit down with your friends for a night, you play it through, and that's it. You can play it another time if you want, but you're playing different characters. So think about the kinds of characters that you want your players to be generating, and you want people to be working with in here. Prospective designers out there, what sort of games are you thinking about? What kind of genre are you thinking about? Like mecha games, more generic sci-fi games? Like what? Go ahead and call it out. Anybody? About cryptids? So like hunting them or like researching them? You are cryptids. Cool. Yeah. So depending on how complex you wanted to make that, depending upon the arc you wanted to make that, there's so many different ways you can go with that. So that's why it's important when you talk about your high concept, what you want your game to be about, that you really drill down what you want to do. Like just to spitball, I don't know anything about your game, but if you were to use being a cryptid as a metaphor for being LGBT or something like that, thinking about that and thinking about the experiences you can sort of use with that can provide you a lot of the mechanics and a lot of the feeling that you want to impart. Now, there is a risk to doing that. And that risk is that things don't always translate from one experience cleanly to another. And there's a possibility of giving offense in there. My friend Chris Spivey did a book called Harlem Unbound, which is about the Cthulhu mythos, and it's about it's in Call of Cthulhu, but it takes place in 1920s Harlem. And I don't know if people here don't know this, but H.P. Lovecraft was a raging racist. Google what he named his cat, but don't say it out loud. Yeah, no, it's bad. He was a raging racist, and my friend Chris, who's a Black veteran, he's a wonderful game designer. He wanted to make a game that took that racism head on, that really dealt with it, and so it's not just present in the game as an overt thing, and it is. There's actually mechanics for how to deal with the social pressures of racism and that sort of thing in the 1920s. But it's also a metaphor for the sort of alienation and a metaphor for being in the Cthulhu mythos and that sort of thing, and feeling adrift or feeling cut off. So Chris was able to relate that really well. Similarly, another game that I really enjoyed working on was Changeling the Lost, which is a White Wolf game. You play changelings, you play people who were kidnapped by the true Fae in Arcadia, and they were forced into some sort of role. And because you breathe the air in Arcadia and you ate the food and drank the water, you are irreparably changed into whatever your role is. If you are a candle for some Fae lord, your skin is made of wax and you burn with an incredible intensity. If they wanted you to be a hunting beast, then you are now a beast, and you're that. And there's a mask you wear when you come back. There's like a glamour that you have because you've escaped, right? Changeling the Lost is also very clear that it is a metaphor for abuse and trauma. It's a metaphor for escaping an abusive situation and how you heal from that and how you survive that and how you struggle and grow with that. And in the case of some of the antagonists, it's about how you regress from that as well and how it has caused permanent damage to you. So that's a really good example of the high concept that you should be thinking about. Metaphors are often a very good way. They don't necessarily need to be the only way. But if you're thinking about what to convey, that's a really good way to go. Like I said, the pitfall there is that experiences don't translate cleanly. To go to another non-role-playing game example of that, did anyone here watch the second X-Men movie back in the early aughts? X-Men 2? Been a while? Okay, not a lot of hands. Yeah, it's cool. All right, so there's a scene in there where Iceman's family sits down with him, and like all his friends are there and that sort of thing. And he's like, "Mom, Dad, I'm a mutant." And they're like, well, we didn't want to admit it, and blah blah blah. And his mom's like, "Have you tried not being a mutant?" And that's a metaphor for coming out as gay to your parents, and it works. It works really well because it translates that similar experience. But then you look at like True Blood, and you're like, you see like anti-vampire protesters, and they're like, "You just don't understand me because I've got love in my heart." And it's like, no, you're a 1,000-year-old ravening monster. Like they are right to protest you. You drink blood. Like you can't escape that. So that doesn't translate quite as well. There are experiences that you can borrow and establish empathy with, but establishing total sympathy with them, making the same experience it runs into some serious pitfalls. Okay. So you've got your high concept down, and you have a rough idea of the sort of systems you want to put into play. So now let's talk about the actual nitty-gritty of getting out and designing it, because the ideas are the easy part. Actually writing it is the really hard part. If you want a team of writers, if you want a group of people, you need to create a development document, and you need to take on the role of developer. You can be the chief writer, you can still be in there, but you need to think about what you're doing, and you need to think about what the project is going to be from a project management standpoint. Just as an aside, I think this is becoming much more prevalent in discussions these days, but to bring it up here, don't ask people to do work without offering them some kind of compensation. It doesn't necessarily need to be monetary. I've had people play test a game for me, just one session of play test, like a 4 or 5 hour thing. And I say, "Hey, just give me your email, and when the book is finished and everything, you'll get a credit and you'll get a PDF copy of the book." And that's yes.
Exposure to dirty work. Don't say you'll pay someone for exposure.
Yeah, exactly. People die of exposure. It's not good. So, like I said, it doesn't necessarily need to be purely monetary. It could just be access to the product at the end. But it's something you need to consider, and it's something you need to be upfront about. And that kind of determines how professional you want this to be. Once you get to the level where you're actually like hiring people or you're bringing people in, you want to be able to, you want to at least pay a lawyer a brief fee to look over a contract for you. There's multiple examples online of what good contracts look like for freelance work. Most work in this industry is going to be pay upon completion. There's not going to be any royalty rights, and there's going to be a pay per word count. But there are many different structures out there. I encourage you to look at all of them. There are shops out there that do royalties to writers, and do royalties more down the line, or do profit sharing through Kickstarter, if that's what the road you want to go down. So I encourage you to look at it, but you need to also not just look at it as a game, but also look at it as a business venture, if that's what you want to do. But let's say you don't want to do that. Let's say you just want to start off and design your game and maybe have a friend write on it, maybe not, right? You still need to create an overall design document. You still need to create a development outline for what you want to cover. And you need to be precise about what you want in the book and what you want your word count to be. In publishing and in any kind of design, really, any kind of technical design, word count is king, because that's column inches, that's time spent writing things, that's time spent putting them to paper. And make no mistake, our role-playing games are technical manuals. And I don't just say that because I put it on my resume and I got a job saying, yeah, I've got 15 years of technical writing experience, writing and editing. They are, because they use a highly specific language. They talk about fairly complex topics. They need to be in a very specific format most of the time and a very specific layout using the same terminology, and they need to be done to an exacting word count. Otherwise, it's not going to fit on the page. So they're technical manuals. Yes?
Thank you, I agree with you. When you set up workshops, is that you have a sense for how hard it's to get down to after editing, or is that something to start, before anything hits paper? It's like, all right, this section should have, 1,500 words, et cetera. How do you do that in those stages?
So generally, when you write things, you don't ever want to account for 10% over or 10% under what your target is at. There are situations where you'll start writing a system and you'll realize, wow, I've designed a much more elegant system than I thought. I thought this was going to take 5,000 words. It's taking 2,000. Great. You can put those other words somewhere else if you want to. Or you can make the book shorter. Most publishing outfits and most printers like DriveThruRPG, if you talk to them or you talk to a layout person, they can say, well, if you have this number of words and this number of column inches, it'll be this many pages. And you can design the book out that way, and you can also design the ad buy that way if you want to buy art copy. So understanding things, and I realize this is much more than just designing a role-playing game, but it really is a larger endeavor. It is not just a task of technical design and writing. It's a task of understanding the development process and the way things go, and eventually when to get it to editing, and understanding project management, understanding how to get it to fruition. So when everyone's here to design their own role-playing games, who here wants to actually publish them? Just show of hands. You want to publish them? You want to sell them on itch or drive-through? Yep, maybe. That's okay. That's totally fine. If you're just designing on your own, just, you don't have to do any of that. I mean, don't ask your friends to do work without paying them, at least in pizza, if nothing else. That's okay. Like it was a revelation the first time someone was like, you should really buy your DM a pizza every time you game. And I was like, every time I game, I'm not made of money. And they're like, well, you don't have to do it, but everyone should chip in like $5. And that DM has spent 4 or 5 hours out of their week to design a game for you. So maybe give them $5 and a pizza. And it's like, yeah, actually that makes a lot more sense, doesn't it, when you break it down like that? So that's the story of how I buy my DM pizza and why I do most of my DMing myself these days. So then I get the pizza. So we've established the sort of business aspect of it. Let's return back to the design aspects. You've got your high concept down. Now you want to design the play at the table, what I like to call popcorn play. Popcorn play is actually like the specific thing that you're doing in the game, and it's the specific experience of rolling dice on the table. Dungeons and Dragons is fundamentally a combat simulator. It's descended pretty vertically from wargaming and from stuff on that, and it still does combat really, really well. It doesn't do non-combat super well at all. It doesn't do social stuff. It doesn't do high-level intrigue, and you can kind of shoehorn stuff into that, but it's tough. It's like a shoe size too small. So that comes back to the thing I brought up at the beginning of this, of the mechanics are what make the game, and the mechanics allow you to design the player experience by limiting their options. You want to be very careful of a situation where you create a decision paralysis. Decision paralysis, for those who don't know, is a sort of psychological phenomenon. You see it a lot, and I'm sure you've experienced it before. When you're given a huge menu of options, it is impossible to decide because you're trying to think about it. At the game table, you don't want to lull in things. That's as much good design as it is good DMing. You don't want players to fall into a lull or be thinking about rules too much or thinking about that. You want to give them a much more limited set of options and then move them forward into that. They choose which of those options they want, and they roll into it. Let me give you another example. Jenna Moran, who I mentioned before, did a lot of her design work on a game called Exalted, and there's a specific type of Exalted called the Sidereals. And so in the design there, the Sidereals have very weird esoteric powers. Their whole purpose is to make sure that destiny and heaven's will get enacted and things go according to plan. And they just have a lot of strange powers to accommodate that. One of the really horrifying powers that Jenna wrote is called Shun the Smiling Lady, and it's that you touch someone and you use this power, and for a year and a day, no one can love them. People can like them, people can work with them, but if anyone's currently in love with them, they're out. They fall out of love with them, and nobody can reestablish that with them for a year. And it's like, wow, that's horrible, but how do I use that? And so when you give a bunch of players like a lot of, it was really an interesting experience, because she gave such a huge suite of esoteric options. You had to really think about how to engineer situations in order to get these things. And you started really thinking like, okay, if I need to enact this sort of destiny, what am I going to be doing? And that's the perfect place for the players to be in. They are thinking as their character, they're thinking, what do I need to do and what do I need to be doing? So even that said, you need to be aware of diegetic mechanics versus adiegetic mechanics, or meta mechanics. One of the experiences I had working on Storypath was realizing that a lot of trad games and a lot of Storypath games or a lot of storyteller games rather, that although they started off saying like you can do whatever you want in the story, you can do whatever you do in there, in a weird way they were almost as limited as the Powered by the Apocalypse games into specific moves, because nothing on those character sheets represented anything outside of the game world. Some things were extracted, but they all represented something discrete within the game world. If you're a vampire, your blood pool was how much blood you had in you at any one time, or your willpower was your discrete level of willpower reserve, of heroic reserve. There was nothing in there that dealt player to player. And when I first started trying to play the Fate system, Fate has a meta currency called Fate Points that come out of a negotiation directly between the GM and the player. The character is not involved at all, and Fate Points represent nothing inside the world at all. I think in some Fate games they can represent some abstract version of luck, but in a lot of the ones I started, they don't really represent anything. And they're an adiegetic mechanic. They're a meta mechanic. Don't be afraid to use meta mechanics, but be clear that when you do that, you are putting people at a remove from their character, which can be good and bad. They're not thinking of decisions as the character, but they are thinking, what do I want to happen to my character? Fate's big success, and the first time I'd ever really seen this, is that it gave you more fate points and more bonuses for playing your character badly, for having them make a poor decision, for having their flaws cause them to have trouble. And that was really unique because I just hadn't seen that. It's not something that comes up in D&D. It's not something that comes up in Storyteller. It's not something that people really go through. And it was refreshing and it was unique. And having the key there that we're coming back to is that it was always player choice. It was always player initiated, whether they wanted to push forward their flaws. And players did that and had their characters do stupid things just because it gave them more fate points and allowed them to succeed at the stuff that really mattered. So what that eventually engendered in a lot of stories, the first time I really read the Fate system was the Dresden Files books. Has anyone really read the Dresden Files series? A lot of people in here? Okay, for those who don't, it's a urban fantasy series about a wizard in Chicago. Although if you've ever been to Chicago, that version of the city looks nothing like it. In the first, 2/3 of the book, the main character usually gets beaten up a bunch. He gets his stuff blown up. He gets his car destroyed. He gets a curse on him, whatever. It sucks to be him for the first 2/3 of the book. And then the last third of the book is him, pushing through by luck and pluck and skill and winning the day. And the whole arc of the fate point system and the whole arc of the Dresden Files role-playing game was meant to emulate that sort of novel structure. You would accept bad things happening to your character. You would accept bad things happening to the world around them, or accept them making mistakes, or accept them playing up their vices or their flaws. And then you'd be accumulating fate points as you go along. And then when it gets closer to the climax, you can actually spend all of those fate points and just steamroll the opposition, much like Harry. So it exactly emulated what you were doing. And that gets back to, again, genre emulation and the story that you actually want to tell. And they don't need to necessarily be very, they don't necessarily need to be hidden in that either. Does anyone here play Bluebeard's Bride? It's sort of vaguely powered by the apocalypse. It follows the story of Bluebeard. For those who don't know, a beautiful woman marries a very ugly man who lives in a castle, who has a blue beard, and he's very rich. And he's kind to her on their wedding night and everything. And he says, "Well, I need to leave my castle for a few days, and you have free run of everywhere in the castle, but you cannot go in this one door in the basement. Do not open that door." And of course, she opens the door, and inside are all of his previous wives who are dead by his hand. Terrible. And then he murders her, because that's the way old fairy tales go. So you actually, in Bluebeard's Bride, you are playing the titular bride, but you're actually playing like aspects of her personality going through there. The players sort of inhabit one single character and collaboratively guide her through it. You want to think in tabletop design, especially, about making that collaborative experience the heart of it. Players work better when they play off one another, when they play up each other's strengths, when their characters highlight each other and complement them. PvP is not a really good thing in tabletop. It almost never is. And when it occurs, you always want to make sure that you're emphasizing that it's a character versus character thing and not a player versus player thing. So nothing shuts down a group faster. So always be wary of designing mechanics and designing things that could cause some sort of negative social interaction at the table. So when I was designing Storypath, I had a really amazing game designer on there. And she pointed out something to me about a mechanic I was designing that I hadn't considered before. She said, like, the mechanic was basically, you have a pool of points, and it accumulates through things that all the characters do, but you can borrow dice from the pool, essentially, and roll them with your thing. And I had this whole system of like nominations and like spotlights and everything. And she pointed out to me that her early role-playing experiences, especially as a woman in tabletop, made it difficult sometimes for wallflowers to shine. It made it difficult sometimes for someone to put forward, and the fact that it needed to be like voted on by the rest of the group. She said, I see the intent, but this could be open to abuse, and this could be open to creating a negative play interaction between players at the table. And I was like, you're right. So we changed the mechanic a little bit, but we altered the mechanic. If you do decide to have a writing team, make sure they're diverse. Make sure that you have a lot of different voices and a lot of different experiences on there, because it just makes for a better game. They see things that you don't, and they have different experiences than you, and they bring all of that to the table, and it makes a much richer and deeper product. Okay. So, we're doing fine on time. So you've created your high concept, and you've thought a lot about play at the table, and you've thought about what you're doing there. As a practical matter, your next step is going to be play testing. And even if you just have a one-page zine game, play testing is going to be very vital, because that's where the rubber meets the road, and that's where you actually determine whether or not your game is actually doing what you want it to do, whether it's creating the experience you want it to create. So, mindful earlier of don't ever ask someone to do work without paying them somehow. Then, you can offer to do pizza night and have everyone come over and test your game. If they all agree to that, great, perfect. You can say, hey, I'll give you credit and a PDF of the book. If they agree to that, cool. Be mindful of the proportions of work you're asking them to do, but if you're just asking them for one session, sure, I'll do that for a line in the book and a slice of pizza and a PDF. Absolutely. I'll spend an evening on that. You want to have iterative playtesting. So you want to have a group together, depending on what you want to do. Unless you're designing like a solo game. A solo game or a two-person game, and those are different beasts entirely. Solo games are meant for just the person to play them, and there are some really cool games out there like Parsley that do that. Parsley is meant to replicate the old 1970s and 1980s Infocom video games that are just like text-based entirely. And with Parsley, you walk through the interactions that you have with that. There's also a player to player or DM to player, solo adventure like Ironsworn is a really good one. Those have specific mechanics that are meant to engender an experience for one person, and they're meant really well. They're meant to do that. To emphasize a larger point that the DM is a player too, and that's something you should always remember. I mentioned this early in my early DMing, my intro to DMing, but the DM or GM or whatever you want to call it has different roles and responsibilities depending on what the system is, and also that is something that you need to decide what those roles and responsibilities are when you're writing it. But fundamentally, they are another player too. If you're asking someone to sit there and create the world and adjudicate things, they're also playing the game. They're also interacting with it. They're also rolling mechanics and working with things there. They're playing it as much as anyone else is playing it. And it's incumbent on them to have fun. So think about whether you want to have a DM at all. There are some DM-less games. Think about what you want the roles and responsibilities are. Do you want your GM to be a rules adjudicator only and have the story be player driven and have the players like going forward and asking questions and creating the world, and the GM maybe has the veto power? Do you want them to be more in charge of creating the story and crafting the story like in more traditional models? Do you want them to just be purely reacting to the world like Empowered by the Apocalypse? There's many different models and there's many different ways to do it, but that's something you need to think about and you need to design for. So we got about 15 minutes left, but I want to hear from a lot of you, since this is ostensibly a workshop. I want to hear from a lot of you about what you're designing and what specific problems you're having and what specific design issues you're having, and maybe we can work through them here. So anyone, just go ahead. Yes.
Absolutely don't share anyone. I actually have a story about a game that I currently am working on. I already have a prototype of it. I just never actually published it yet. And it's an interesting story because it includes a mechanic initially that I dropped to actually include the game. Basically called the Conspiracy. You're basically a group of hackers that cooperate to infiltrate the forum of Poland. It has trigger warning, obviously.
Yeah.
And to make a long story short, I originally had it so that you roll
was not working. Everyone who places said that this was not going to work, so I basically just dropped it and made it so that when you place it behind the form, it basically just put it apart
Yep.
and improved it like tenfold.
Yeah. Simplicity is key. Simplicity is great, and those sorts of things to do. You were thinking about the play experience you wanted to engender, and it was less actual cryptography, which is really boring unless you're super into numbers, and the people who are weird. You wanted more of the experience of it, the Hollywood hacking, the genre experience of it, and that's what you played up, and that's what you designed your mechanics to do. So that is a very good example of being aware of what is simulationism versus what you want the game to actually do. Someone else, anyone? Yes.
I'm a very story-rich person and a very lore person, but I have, ideas of campaigns I want to write, different tabletop systems that I'd like to create, but I don't know how to go about creating a rule system. Do you have any sense or tricks for baseline what to do to make that?
Well, this workshop, for one. But I understand what you mean. Like I said at the start of this, when I started, I'd have a lot of people come up to me, when I was developing projects. I started as a writer, and then I moved on to become a developer and an editor, and then, a further designer. I'd always have people come up to me and say, well, I really want to write story, and I really like narration, but mechanics, I just let someone else do that. I don't want to do it. And you need to decide, and this is not a judgment in any way, I want to stress that, whether you want to primarily tell a prose story or whether you want it to be a mechanism and a game world for players to engage with, and what that give and take is going to be, because that's a role-playing game. I was once that person as well. I was once, considered myself very system poor, but I got over it just by reading a lot of systems, by reading things, by playing other games and seeing what I liked out of them. Game design is iterative. The playtesting is iterative. You want to have more than one round of playtesting, but it's also iterative in the sense that a lot of games are Frankensteins. They're stuff taken from other games and other experiences that they've had and smushed together and hit with a lightning bolt. And that's what they are. Sometimes they come out hideous, shambling monsters. Sometimes they come out really nice, like a bride of Frankenstein, if you will. I'm happy to talk with you a little bit more about it if you have any specific questions and to get a little bit more of a sense. But as just a general thing to get started, read more games, play more games, and think about what other similar games are doing and see how you can do it better, and see if you can think of a simpler or cleaner or more elegant way to do it. Sure.
There's a lot of one-page RPGs that are on light, they're really good light. Fiasco and Black Monk are two really light that you roll with one dice and get it all cheesy like stuff.
I love one page. I play one called Honey Heist, but I think it's so cute, so fun.
Oh, I like Honey Heist.
You know Honey Heist?
Mm-hmm.
It's so fun. It's so simple and so good. I would love to play games like that with other people.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of those games are one-page games. They're simple. They're very simple. And I know it's a daunting challenge to start developing your own role-playing game, but it doesn't even need to be that 256-page full-color core rulebook with a hardback and everything. And even if it is, those systems are often much simpler than they seem to be. They are polished because they've been through a lot of iterative playtesting and a lot of design, but they're simple at the core of them. So the other lesson I should impart to all of you really is don't be afraid to design. Don't be afraid to jump in there. Don't be afraid to say, well, I'm not a professional game designer. I don't know this and this. It works. Speaking as a professional game designer, it's not rocket science. And even the stuff that is rocket science is not all that hard to figure out if you think about it really, really quickly. I played Kerbal Space Program. I could get through this. So don't succumb to imposter syndrome and don't sabotage yourself. Have a bit of confidence. A lot of the best games and the best design started out from players saying, this game is not really doing for me what I want it to do, and then thinking about what they wanted it to do, and then creating their own system and going forward there. That's how Powered by the Apocalypse came about. That's how the Age system came about. That's just how a lot of them came about. Yes. Yeah, I would stagger them. I sometimes return to the same group, but you run into diminishing returns. First off, most groups and most games fall apart after about 6 weeks. And even then, that's a commitment for some folks. So you need to have your pool there, but realize that you may only get them for a short amount of time. So you want to make the most of that time that you can. But then if they burn out or if they stop or whatever, you can go on to a new group. So I would run a session with, if you wanted to say design a game for 4 to 6 players, I'd run a game with 4 players, and then I'd run another game for a separate 6 players, and then I'd come back to the original 4 or so. And that way you can keep iterating, keep polishing it, and make sure that every time you sit down in front of a new group, it's a new iteration. It's a new part of that. And by the way, if you're not super comfortable with file names and file types and actually like writing the iteration of what it is, get comfortable. Because otherwise you're gonna mess up your iteration, and you're gonna have old rules in there, and it's gonna be a mess. So put a date on everything you do, and put what version it is, and then you're fine. You're fine that way. You can be like, oh yeah, okay, this is that. Does that help? Okay. Yes, on the side there. I'm sorry? Are you? I'm pointing at you. Mm-hmm.
The thought that I had, I played a lot of the Genesis Star Wars games with destiny points, which are basically. And I thought about how we switched to mostly virtual tabletops in the last couple of years. Do you think that it's worthwhile assuming people will be using a virtual tabletop? And one thing we found is that, like, Genesis's dice are kind of terrible in person. Great when the computer's.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. When it just tells you what the result is, you're like, perfect. This works awesome. Yes, to kind of cut to the heart of that, because of the time we have left. When I say design for play at the table, I don't necessarily mean a literal table, a literal group of people around there. Design for virtual tabletops it's subtly different, but it is different than designing for an around the table thing. If you have a game that requires a lot of social interaction between players and characters, like that's maybe more suited for an actual table, or it's suited for someone who has a really good camera on their virtual tabletop rig. But you need to make that clear as well in what you're designing. And it's okay to design something that's more meant for a virtual tabletop space, but you need some work on the back end to create the systems and the tools that are necessary to make that go. In the case of Genesis, in the case of Star Wars, you have the die result, and that means programming the die results into a simulator or a die roller, or using the app that it comes along with, or that sort of thing. That's just some overhead you need to think about. To give you a tragic example of that not happening, I did a lot of design work on Exalted 2nd edition, and I didn't work on the core book for Exalted 3rd edition. And the designers of the core book for 3rd edition really tried to translate a lot of rules from video games and a lot of experiences in video games, and they didn't translate perfectly. So they were a little weird there. But the initiative system in it, while it's really interesting and intriguing, is a huge amount of effort for the GM to keep track of. It's a huge amount for the players to keep track of. It's easy if you see on the computer and you say, okay, I do this move, I lose this amount of initiative, and you can see how it changes and like who's next in the order. But on the table, you have to keep that in your mind, or you have to scribble it down on a notebook, and it's just a bear. It just is. So that goes back a little bit to the advice I gave earlier about being mindful of the amount of cognitive load you're putting on the players and you're putting on the GM, because that's going to really affect your game as well. The advice to go for simplicity is also meant to reduce the amount of cognitive load on the players, including the GM. Decision paralysis is just another type of cognitive load. And you want your players to be fundamentally focusing on what choices do they have than trying to remember huge blocks of numbers and huge blocks of, well, okay, blah, 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 blah. And that's not to say that you should never require numbers. You should never require that. There's a meme floating around on the internet today, or on TTRPG internet anyway, about someone complaining that they never learned anything useful in school. And then someone's like, okay, well, if my cleric's 25 feet in the air and I cast Cloud Kill, how many squares do I need to hit it? And it's like, that's the Pythagorean theorem. Did you not pay attention in geometry? And it's like, yeah. So, that's don't be cognizant of the cognitive load on there you're putting on players, but also don't be afraid of putting a little bit on them when it really should be on them. And I guess the last point on that I want to make is I talked a little bit earlier about the potential for abuse in mechanics and the way teams will spot that and the way teams will look at that. And the biggest advice I can give you is it can be really tempting to design your mechanics so that they are perfectly hermetically sealed and airtight, and there's no room for abuse whatsoever, and there's no way that anyone can do it. And you have dozens of exceptions and rules in that, but that's just gonna put a huge load on you as a designer. It's gonna create overwrought text, and it's gonna create unusable mechanics. Don't design for assholes. And maybe a more charitable way of saying that is assume good faith on the part of the players. Assume a good faith interpretation of these things. There's always going to be people at the table who have a bad faith interpretation of it, who's like, okay, well, I can cast Goodberry, right? And I can cast create water. Well, I'm gonna create a Goodberry pomegranate juice company and just make tons of gold. And it's like, you've missed the point of the game. You've missed it. Someone else very amusingly pointed out that in Shadowrun 3rd edition, all of the adventures awarded a painfully small amount of money, and all the characters were created with a huge amount of gear that cost millions and millions. It would take you tons of jobs to even get up to the starting character amount of wealth, apparently. Someone calculated that if you start stealing cars rather than running dangerous Shadowrun missions for corporations, you make a ton more money. So, just taking them in to be chopped up, it's way safer, way easier, way more profitable. They've also missed the point of the game, but I think in a way that very amusingly highlights that maybe something on the part of the designers was not well thought out. And maybe there was some adjusting or some other element that you need to take into play. But yeah, don't design for assholes. You'll never get all of them. But assume good faith, avoid obvious abuses, and last but not least, never be afraid of speaking directly to the GM and directly to the players. Don't be afraid of writing a mechanic and then putting in a little sidebar that says, this is how this mechanic is supposed to be used. I don't know if anyone here ever played the old World of Darkness games. Yeah, Okay. So Old World Darkness had the mechanical willpower that refreshed very rarely, but it caused a confirmed success whenever you were rolling. So it was a huge benefit. And so, of course, it was extremely rare. You almost never wanted to use it. When they designed the system for the new World of Darkness, which was similar to the old system, they designed the dice pools in such a way that you had a much riskier chance of success on the same quote unquote action. But willpower added 3 dice to your roll, which was mathematically about where a confirmed success would be. And so they wanted you to be chasing the mechanisms in the game that cause you to regenerate willpower, because you should be spending it on the rolls that are important, but they never actually pointed that out to anybody. So everyone coming from the old World of Darkness was like, I never want to spend willpower. And then they were like, but I keep failing at all these rolls. This is terrible. What a crappy game. And it's like, yeah, I mean, that may that's clarity on the part of the designers that should be communicated. So I think we are just about time, or just a minute or so over. I am happy to stand out there and answer any questions you might have. Happy to share my contact information if you want to like DM me or something and ask me a design question, or have me talk about my experiences in role-playing games or my experiences in the industry. Happy to do it. Absolutely. So yeah, thank you all for coming.